Hey guys, so in today's video, I want to talk about reconciling Eastern and Western pictures of the afterlife. Stay tuned. So I think that one of the most challenging things that we come up against when we look at perennialism is this vast difference in terms of afterlife thinking that we see in the West versus the East, right? Within Hinduism, within Buddhism, with all of the religions of the East, we see this emphasis on reincarnation. It's really treated in many respects as just an easily assumable fact, right? Whereas in the West, within Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, we don't really see reincarnation, right? We see this emphasis on a heaven and hell scenario, and eternal life or eternal damnation. And I think in many ways we are, kind of challenged by this, where it seems as though we have in our hands an irreconcilable contradiction. I mean, some of the passages that we read within Christian and Catholic tradition are so averted to reincarnation ideas. In fact, Origen was a great biblical scholar who was in the early church, and he was excommunicated because he argued for reincarnation within early Christianity. But I think that in many ways, especially in the West, it's become increasingly difficult for us to sort of put this issue off, to say, the Hindus and Buddhists, they've just got these goofy ideas about reincarnation because, well, number one, we have a big issue that comes from the fact that we now know scientifically that the world is much, much older than what we originally would have thought. As, creationists argue the world is only 6,000 years old, right? But, this really falls to pieces, because what are you supposed to assume? That there's a Tyrannosaurus Rex heaven? That Brontosaurus had his own unique hell? I mean, what happened to Pikaia? What happened to Australopithecines? Did they go to heaven? Did they go to hell? This kind of black and white heaven and hell cosmology really, it's hard to reconcile with a rational picture of the world. And even within the religion itself, it's got its own subtle inconsistencies. I mean, how are we supposed to believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God when he just casually sends people to an eternal damnation in hell, to be tortured and tormented for all time? I mean, is the devil even going to remember what he was guilty of 1 billion years from now? I mean, in 1 trillion years, are sinners even going to know who the hell they are? I mean, the idea of burning in hell for all eternity really contradicts reason. It doesn't seem to jive with an intuitive sense of how the world works. I mean, even when we look at the world, we see the constant renewal of nature, that things die and then rise again, the coming and going of the seasons. Nature always seems to be inclined towards cyclical forms of existence, and this is precisely what the Hindus and the Buddhists are arguing for, that consciousness itself moves through cycles of life and death and rebirth. So for me personally, this was an issue that I had to ponder on for quite a while. And, what really helped it was my own near-death experience, because I had these marked experiences where I saw consistencies between both Christian as well as Hindu and Buddhist ideas, notably the similarity between the bardo of dying that's described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the apocalypse of the Bible. And I've talked about this in other videos where, when I was having this experience, I had the distinct sense that my life was only ever a dream and that everything was coming to pieces, everything was coming apart. And I recognized it from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I recognized it from what I had learned in Buddhism, but I was also imminently aware of the fact that this was an apocalyptic vision, that I was watching the end of the world, and I distinctly felt as though it was indeed the end of time. One of the fascinating things I've noticed in looking at Buddhist thinking as compared to that of Christians is when we talk about the resurrection from the dead.
The hand of the Lord was upon me. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley. As I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them. But there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath, and say to it, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe into these slain that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army.
Now I want to present to you guys a possible theory on this that I find really fascinating and compelling. And keep in mind, it is sort of a hypothesis. It's a working theory. But one of the things that the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes is that immediately following someone's death, they go into a condition of unconsciousness comparable to that of sleep, right? The person completely loses their awareness.
O child of noble family, listen. Now the pure luminosity of the Dharmata is shining before you. Recognize it. The female Buddha Samantabhadri. But this state of mind is not just blank emptiness. It is unobstructed, sparkling, pure, and vibrant. This mind is the male Buddha Samantabhadra. These two, your mind, whose nature is emptiness without any substance whatever, and your mind, which is vibrant and luminous, are inseparable. This is the Dharmakaya of the Buddha. This mind of yours is inseparable luminosity and emptiness in the form of a great mass of light. It has no birth or death. Therefore, it is the Buddha of immortal light. To recognize this is all that is necessary. When you recognize this pure nature of your mind as the Buddha, looking into your own mind is resting in the Buddha mind. According to good or bad karma, the prana escapes into the right or left nadi and comes out through the apertures of the body, and the consciousness suddenly becomes clear. To say that this lasts for the time taken to eat a meal depends on whether he is sensitive or insensitive, and on whether or not he has practiced. Then his consciousness emerges, and he does not know whether he is dead or not. You will see his relatives gathered there, just as before, and hear their cries.
After a period of time, and this period of time varies from individual to individual, they will suddenly wake up in a dream-like condition of life. And this is really, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, described as coming into a dream of one's former life experience. You come into a scenario where suddenly, you think that you're alive, and you wake up in your bed, and you go to work, everything seems normal, but then suddenly you realize when you speak to people, they don't respond. You go to touch a hot burner, and you don't feel anything. And then you begin to say to yourself, oh no, I think I'm dead, right? And if a person is trapped in this state, this is often what we think of as a ghost, right? Somebody wandering through the bardo, wandering through the dream-like landscape of their own mind.
Princess, are you in here? Princess, can you at least let us know you're in here? Maybe say something, move something.
In the beginning, you can hear what sounds like, hello, is there somebody there?
Right. Princess, are you in here?
I could hear that crystal clear.
At one point, Jay says, Princess, are you in the room? And it sounds like she says, of course I'm in the room. Where are you?
Princess, can you at least let us know you're in here? Maybe say something. Maybe say something.
I heard that with my own ears. I just...
Within the Abrahamic traditions, there's this notion of the resurrection of the dead, that on the day of judgment, the dead will be raised, that they will come up as if though they were sleeping, It says in the Bible that those who have slept in Christ, those who are sleeping, will rise from the dead, and then they will be brought into a condition where they can run without tiring, where they can move without the burden of weight. Muhammad describes it saying that a fat man of 400 pounds on the day of resurrection will weigh no more than the wing of a mosquito. This is to say that you've entered the dream world, you've entered the spirit world, wherein which the heaviness of physical matter, the grossness of the earth has been thrown off. And I really see in this a tremendous parallel, that perhaps what the biblical tradition is describing as resurrection from the dead may be this condition that immediately follows death, this going into unconsciousness and then suddenly waking up in a dream-like experience of one's own life. In fact, just recently, I had a really good friend of mine message me on Facebook. Unfortunately, her fiance passed away about a year ago in a boating accident. They were out on Sylvan Lake and a very strong wind came up and capsized the boat, and he hit his head, and that was it. He never woke up. They had to issue search parties to go and look for the body, and in fact, a couple of friends of mine were involved. But just here recently, she said that she had a dream about her former fiance, and she says he came up in the dream and they were all camping together. And she says he looked better than usual, even better than he had looked while he was alive. He seemed to be full of vitality and energy, but he strangely did not seem to know that he was dead. She was never given this impression that he was distinctly aware of the fact that he had really died. And so he seems to have been moving, perhaps, through this very dreamlike experience of life. Also recently, I had another viewer message me about someone he spoke to who slipped into a coma, and he said that in the coma he found himself in this dream-like landscape, and he was moving around in this landscape and running and jumping and feeling full of life. He says he could even recall the tension he felt in his calves as he was running and not tiring. This is precisely the kind of language that's used to describe the resurrection from the dead. Now, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as well as Christian and Abrahamic traditions, seem to emphasize that following this comes the dismantling of the world. The Buddhas in the Tibetan Book of the Dead come and they project into the soul the lights, the vitality, the potency of their power. And if you can endure their presence, then you're found worthy and you can move through into Buddha Pure Lands by descending into the heart of, say, Amitabha. Right? Within Christian tradition, Christ comes seated upon the throne of heaven and riding upon the clouds, right? And he comes as the judge of the nations, and he judges you according to your sins, according to your deeds here on earth. And then here is really where things also are fascinating, because both within the Buddhist tradition as well as within Christian tradition, the result of your judgment will determine the existence of your next life. So within Christian thinking, we say that the person is resurrected, that they receive a new body in Christ, and either this body is condemned to hell for limitless eons, or it's taken up into heaven and enjoys eternal life with Christ. Within Buddhist thinking, you are not resurrected, but reborn, and you inherit a new body, and you can descend into hell realms, where you can spend countless eons in a condition of torment. In fact, some of the biggest numbers that were ever invented were invented by Buddhist scribes who were trying to describe the lengths of time that sinners would have to endure within the hell realms as a consequence of their immoral actions in a former life. Now, it really is interesting because the Buddhists, they suggest that the soul is capable, or the I, the Buddha nature, is capable of moving into another incarnation. Now, you might notice my hesitation there in using the word soul, and that's due to the fact that Buddhists don't really believe in the soul. They don't really use this concept of a soul to infuse their spiritual thinking. They refrain from this because it was a fundamental teaching of the Buddha that said there is no I, there is no self. And the emphasis here was on the fact that the Buddha recognized that our sense of an I, our sense of a self, is an aggregate. It's built up of various pieces coming together. So you have the body, you have memories, you have consciousness, you have the perceptions, the impulses, these 5 aggregates coming together, and they form what we conceive of as the self. But in death, this can be dismantled, this can be broken apart, and at the core of it all is simply Buddha nature, which is the pure consciousness, the awareness, right? The true self, the self with a big S, if you will. Now, you may notice here that this is a striking dissimilarity in terms of thinking, because Christians, Muslims, and Jews are always going on about saving one's soul, rescuing one's soul. You know, that's to say the emphasis in Christian thinking is on saving the ego, saving the self, whereas in Eastern thinking, the self is regarded as illusory and secondary and something to be gotten rid of. And I think this fundamental difference helps us to recognize what is really going on here. Because within Catholic tradition, within the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's said that hell is eternal separation from God. And we traditionally say that hell is where? It's down in the earth. Well, now, you know, it's safe to say in the light of modern science that heaven is not up there above the clouds, nor is hell likely below the earth. Rather, these are metaphors for the kind of cosmology that we see within spiritual life, right? That when people dream, they can move up into the spirit world by flying, or they can descend through cracks in the rock down into the earth, into subterranean spirit realms, right? So this is a reference to the mind itself, so that descending below the earth, descending below the ocean, is a kind of metaphor for stepping into the depths of the unconscious mind. Now, it's interesting, right? Because maybe you can see here that how all these pieces come together when you look at it this way. If hell is eternal separation from God, as the Catechism says, the suggestion is that hell is eternal separation from consciousness. God is spirit, God is life, God is consciousness, God is breath, ruach, spirit, pneuma, spiritus, right? So if hell is eternal separation from God, the suggestion is that hell is eternal separation from consciousness. And what do we call something that isn't conscious? We call it unconscious, as in the unconscious mind, as in the depths of the earth. Now, the question is, you know, in Christian thinking, the emphasis here is on rescuing the ego. And so if the ego fails to come into perfect union with the divine, it finds itself in a condition of disillusionment, of breaking down, and eventually being eternally separated from consciousness, descending into the depths of the unconscious mind, never to arise from hence ever again. And in Buddhism, we see really precisely the same thing. But the difference is that the Christian tradition, the Western traditions, emphasize the S with a little s, the self with a little s, right? The ego self, whereas in the East, they emphasize the consciousness. See, a lot of people are mistaken in thinking that reincarnation is some kind of good news, you know, as if it's some kind of a good thing. It's not a good thing. Buddhists do not believe, really, that anyone is reincarnated because they do not believe that the self, with a little s, the ego, moves from life to life. They say that the consciousness, the Buddha nature, the Christ-like nature, moves from life to life. So in truth, no one is really reincarnated. You simply cease to exist, dissolve into the depths of the unconscious mind, and then your consciousness moves on into a brand new life. This really comes together and creates for us a cohesive whole when we look at the testimonies of children who claim to remember past lives. And this is a tremendously insightful piece of evidence because it's not something that we can easily dismiss out of hand. I mean, many Christians and Catholics may be inclined to say, oh, well, these kids are just making it up. Well, if these children are making up these memories of a past life, then what's to say that the children of Fatima are not making up everything they saw, right? We have to be really careful with throwing around these accusations of lying, right? But these children, they describe that when they recollect and remember these past lives, they only remember them up to about the age of 5 or 6 years old, which is really interesting because I personally can't remember much prior to the age of 5 or 6 years old. I've really been joking with my wife about this. She's pregnant, and I say, you know, our baby's body is going to show up, but the person that's going to inhabit that body for the rest of its life is not going to probably show up for another 5 years, right? We don't really recollect much prior to the age of 5 or 6 years old because that is when a new ego begins to form, the new sense of a small self. And the former sense of a self, that past life memory, has slipped into the depths of the unconscious mind, slipped into the depths of the shady shadows of hell, and is no more, and never rises from hence.
James knows a lot about planes, especially war planes.
What kind of airplane is that?
It's a Corsair.
His parents, Andrea and Bruce Leiniger, say from an early age, James would play with nothing else.
He was obsessed with airplanes. If you look around the house, that's all you'll see. Airplanes, helicopters, aircraft carriers.
But then, when he was 2, the planes James loved suddenly began to give him frequent and frightening nightmares.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And he'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out."
They sound like typical kiddie nightmares, but Andrea says they went on the same way for months.
I talked to my mom about it. A lot of times my mom had said maybe he's remembering a past life.
What did you say?
Politely, baloney.
Andrea and Bruce of Lafayette, Louisiana are a highly educated, modern couple. To them, the possibility that their little son James was manifesting signs of a former life was, well, a little out there.
You know, having a past life is not the initial conclusion that you come to. You try and figure out any other way he could have. Did he see anything? Has there ever been anything on television, anything that we've discussed?
But as time went by, Andrea didn't know what to believe.
We are taught from a very early age in this culture, in the Judeo-Christian culture, that reincarnation doesn't exist. Once you observe this in a child, and the evidence is very compelling, you have to open up to another explanation for what is going on.
Bruce was deeply skeptical.
He said there has to be a logical explanation.
I don't believe in past lives. I don't believe in this stuff.
But with the violent nightmares recurring 3 and 4 times a week, the Leinigers felt they had to do something. So with guidance from Bowman, they cautiously began to encourage James to share his memories. They say the result was startling.
The nightmares immediately started reducing in frequency. He went down from 3 or 4 times a week to maybe 1 a week, 1 every other week. And at that point was when he started to articulate more about these past life memories.
These memories tend to fade between the ages of 5 to 7.
His parents say between the ages of 2 and 4, James would reveal extraordinary details about the life of a former fighter pilot, mostly at bedtime, when he was drowsy.
Bruce said, "What happened to your plane?" He said, "It crashed on fire." And Bruce said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." And Bruce said, "Well, who shot your plane?" And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, "Oh, the Japanese."
Still, despite these extraordinary stories, Bruce remained dubious. Almost to prove they couldn't be true, he began to piece together the details James was sharing. And what he found, he says, shook him to the core. For in many instances, the stories appeared to match the facts. James seemed to be recalling real events, real people, in the life of a man who'd been dead for almost 60 years.
Bruce had always said, "What kind of plane did you fly?" And he said, "A Corsair."
Yeah.
He said a Corsair?
He said the word Corsair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not only did James remember flying a Corsair, he demonstrated knowledge of the plane's peculiarities, like the time he was flipping through a book about planes when he was 4.
And he got to the Corsair and he said, "That's a Corsair." And he goes, "You know what? They used to get flat tires all the time."
In fact, historians and pilots agree that the plane's tires took a lot of punishment on landing. Of course, this is a fact that could easily be found in books or on TV. But then, James began to offer up the kinds of specific details his parents say are harder to explain away.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, "Do you remember where your plane took off?" And he said, "It took off of a boat." "Do you remember the name of your boat?" "Natoma." "Do you remember what your name was?" And he'd always say, "James." His name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, "Do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with?" And he said, Jack Larson.
Bruce began doing some research. Almost immediately, he discovered that the Natoma was an actual ship, a small aircraft carrier in the Pacific called the Natoma Bay. And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma Bay. In fact, he's alive and well and living in Arkansas.
And it was like, holy mackerel. I mean, really, you could have poured my brains out of my ears. And I just couldn't believe it.
And there were more clues. Around this time, James began signing crayon drawings and other artwork, James 3.
One day I asked him why he's calling himself James 3. Well, it's because I'm the third James. And every once in a while you ask him that today, and he'll still say the same thing.
And one day, while leafing through a new book about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Bruce turned to an aerial photo of the Pacific Island. James was seated nearby.
He pointed to it and he goes, "Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down." And I said, "What?" "That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And I just went blank. I couldn't say anything.
By then, Bruce had become a man possessed, searching the internet, combing through military records, and interviewing men who served aboard the Natoma Bay. Finally, a breakthrough. He learned that there was just one pilot from the squadron killed at Iwo Jima. That pilot, James M. Houston Jr. Is this why little James was calling himself James 3?
It just crystallized in my mind. This has to be who we're talking about. You know, my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief.
When little James would describe being shot down, he told of how his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine.
We had an airplane, and I said, "Well, can you show me where it was?" And he pointed right up to the front of the engine.
That's what makes this man's story so intriguing. His name is Ralph Klarber. Klarber was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay. On March 3rd, 1945, he took part in a raid near Iwo Jima. As it happens, Klarber's plane was right next to the one flown by James M. Houston Jr. It was to be Hugh's last mission before leaving for home the following day. As Klarber recalls, the sky was thick with enemy flak.
We experienced pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire, but this was the most intense that I experienced at any time.
Suddenly, a flash near the nose of Houston's plane.
I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head-on, yeah, right on the middle of the engine.
Just as little James had described it.
So what do you believe now about your son James?
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston Jr. And he came back because he wasn't finished with something. And that's essentially what I believe.
Dear Bruce and Andrea.
And he's not the only one. This past October, the Leinegers received a letter from a woman named Ann Barron, the sister of pilot James Houston. Andrea and Bruce had contacted her about their little boy. Barron heard about what young James was saying, and she believes.
All of this is still overwhelming. I can only imagine how it has affected you, but I believe, with my love to you, Anne. The child was so convincing and coming up with all these things that there's no way in the world he could know, unless there is a spiritual thing.
You know, this has helped along also when we look at some of the passages that we read in the Bible. You know, this idea of an eternal hell, right, tormenting people, is something we really only see in the book of Revelations. But strangely, in the Old Testament, we don't see that kind of thinking, right? When in some of the writings of Solomon, we hear passages that describe the dead descending into the depths of the underworld, into Sheol, and slipping into darkness as if they go to sleep and simply never wake up. They lose consciousness. You know, J-Rod, one of the big viewers here on the channel, in his vision, you know, it was said to him in a private revelation with Christ standing right there in the vision, you know, consciousness never dies. It simply transforms. You cannot kill the Spirit of God, but it can move from life to life to life. And this really, I think, is where the confusion and the ambiguity is coming from. It's entirely accurate in the West to say that no one is reincarnated, because if you look at the definition of the word reincarnation, it means a person's soul moves from life to life. But if you actually look at the traditions of India, that's not especially what the Buddhists teach, because they do not believe in the existence of an eternal soul. They say the soul is capable of being dismantled. So I think that when the Virgin Mary in some of her visions has said no one is reincarnated, I think she's being 100% honest and accurate, that no one is reincarnated. Only the Spirit of God lives forever. And either we learn to identify with that spirit, with that consciousness, with that divine spark within ourselves, or we simply cease to be and we vanish into the depths of the unconscious mind, never to rise from hence. I also think this helps us to reconcile our picture of the world with modern science, right? To suggest that, you know, that there's this heaven and hell scenario waiting for every sentient being really pushes us into an awkward situation, because, you know, we're forced to ask ourselves, well, how can a loving God condemn a soul to hell forever? Well, he's simply condemning a soul to unconsciousness, to sleep, to non-existence, right? Which in the case of many souls may in fact be a form of mercy. Or when we look at, you know, dinosaurs and all of these extinct creatures, right? What happens to them when they die? Well, their consciousness is likely recycled, just as all the physical things in this world are recycled. You know, the Paschal mystery, Christ rising and descending from the dead. But I think that the eschatology of Christian thinking is vitally important, and that it is accurate, that we should not take refuge in this idea that our consciousness is going to be reborn, that our consciousness will move on from life to life, because that represents no form of salvation for my ego, you know, it represents no form of salvation for my personal soul, right? It's ceasing to exist is not something that I think most of us really look forward to. I mean, you know, I kind of find this all amusing, because when you really stop and think about it, if this really is the way things are, then atheists perhaps are not quite so far from the truth when they say they die and nothing happens. That perhaps they just, you know, are missing out on that awkward, painful scenario in between dying and simply ceasing to exist in the depths of the unconscious mind. But, you know, it's difficult to say. So I hope you guys have found this video insightful. This is an issue I've wrestled with, you know, off and on over the years, and I think that the picture I've developed here really does help us to make a lot of sense. And it doesn't just, you know, reconcile the differences that we see in traditions. It reconciles what we see in the world scientifically. It reconciles what we see in personal testimony of people describing their experiences of reincarnation and, you know, the afterlife. So that I think we don't necessarily have to look at our traditions and say this one's right and this one's wrong. It's more of a sense of this tradition emphasizes this aspect of the afterlife in the West, namely the salvation of one's soul, whereas in the East the emphasis is on the perpetuity of consciousness. The consciousness never dies, it simply transforms. And this difference in emphasis ultimately leads to a difference in eschatology, and it also leads to a difference in theology and the way that we conceptualize the spirit world. But it's always important to remember that the map is not the territory. What we think about the world is a system that we create to help us make sense out of something. And in the case of the spirit world, this is profoundly difficult because we're dealing with things which are deeply mysterious. But the one thing I am absolutely confident of is that these things reflect a true and honest reality, that we do have distinct things to look forward to in the afterlife. And I hope that lends you some encouragement and some motivation to adopt a spiritual life. And as always, thanks for watching.